Okay, so in our last video, we showed how to create a for loop, the syntax for a for loop. And it was a way to iterate through a section of code multiple times. We're going to say that a block of code is going to execute a certain number of times. It'll iterate through. And we declared a variable inside our for loop, which is a counter variable. We said while it is less than 5, and then we incremented. So if I run this, we have in while loop and in for loop. You say, well, what's a while loop? A while loop is another way of iterating a block of code multiple times. Now I wanted to put this up here for a comparison. Both are doing the same thing, but both are handling it in a different way. So here I had to declare a value, a condition. It said value equals 0 while value is less than 5. Write out in while loop and increment. Now I want to go into discuss incrementing a little more for 1 second because we briefly glossed over that in the last video. So incrementing, writing a variable plus plus, an integer variable plus plus, is the same as adding 1 to that variable. Well, C# provides shorthand or shorter ways of doing things. One of them is to plus equal 1 or any value, so that would be another way of doing it. Or we can just do that, which is a very simple, tight, terse way of writing the same thing. But there are 3 different ways to write one statement, and you'll learn how to make your code more compact as we go along. So that's what's happening there. Now, I'm going to give you a chance to think about what might happen if I did not increment that value. So if we're executing through and we're iterating through this this statement, and it's being checked like a conditional, just like an if statement within the parentheses. If the value never changes within this block of code, it will run forever. It's called an infinite loop, getting stuck in an infinite loop. So let me run the program. You see it keeps saying in while loop. It never drops into the for loop. It's in while loop, in while loop, in while loop. It's never going to stop because the condition value less than 5 will always evaluate to true. That would be the same as writing while true. In while loop, in while loop, in while loop. It would never stop. There's no reason, or there's no condition that would ever cause it to stop. So we have to increment value to define when we want to break out of this. So a for loop defines that counter variable, says the condition, so that maps to that, and then increment, so that maps to that. So this is equivalent to this is equivalent to this, and this is equivalent to this. 2 different ways of doing it. Now you may ask yourself why it's different about doing it that way. Well, there might be different conditions and different reasons why you may want to do one or the other. Now, there are a couple of additional loops that I want you to take a look at. One is a for each loop. Same thing, checking a condition. So on one side of a for loop, you have a while loop, which is kind of like the Wild West, where you can just do whatever you want to do within the block of code, just make sure you break out of it at some point in time that this condition evaluates to false. In a for loop, you're really defining a strict structure for a more strict structure for controlling how many times you loop. In a for each, you're actually passing in a collection. So if you remember, a collection is an array. So let me create an array of values that equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we've got an array identified by these brackets. We're going to pass in a collection, and we're going to say for each integer, and we're going to create a counter variable, n, or a variable that stands in the place of the value. For each integer, it's going to be represented by I in values, which is an array of integers. Console dot write line write I. Now that's the equivalent of identifying the subscript. So when you pass values in, it's going to say for the first subscript, I is going to represent 0. It's going to write 1 out. The next time through in values, increment by 1. In that subscript, I represents that value. Write it out. Check it again. And as long as there are values in this array, in this collection, this variable will represent what place you're in. It's read only, and it is forward. It's moving forward. Step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5 through this collection, and this variable is going to represent it. So on the while side, you have this like kind of just do whatever you want, just make sure it eventually becomes false. Here you're saying do it a certain number of times. Here you're saying we know how many times it's going to be because we have an array of a certain size, and do it that many times, but I want access to those values within that collection, which is a for each. So what we'll see here, we should see in while loop 5 times, we should see in loop 4 times, and we should see all of the values of this collection written out, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And there you go. The first loop executed, second loop executed, third loop executed. They all iterated, they all executed a block of code a certain number of times, but how you did that. Now, for each is a very useful, quick way of passing in a collection and just getting all those values out without having to know the size of that collection up front. Some of the things that I've done at work is you might pass in 10,000 or 20,000 very large collections that are dynamic. Sometimes there may be 15 values in this collection. Sometimes there may be 10,000 values in this collection. And what the for each allows you to do is to not have to worry about figuring out how many times to iterate through it. You just pass in that collection in here, and it does all of this checking logic for you and just says, I'm going to start at the first value and go all the way through to the end. One last loop style that I want you to, one last type of loop that I want you to see is on the while side. It's called a do while loop. And the syntax is very similar to while loop. Do. The difference between a do while loop and a while loop is that do will execute the block of code at least one time. Here it may never. So if you say while a value is less than 0, so it's a negative number, this will never execute. Whereas if you did it here, while it's less than 0, let's set it to negative 4 in a do while loop. It will execute at least once, and then it'll run it multiple times. Whereas here, if we said it was less than negative 4, this would never execute. So it's a way of setting up code to guarantee execution at least once. So you've got a lot of options here for iterating, and you would use them in different scenarios. You would use while. If you're working with collections, I highly recommend for each. If you've got to do something to those collections while you're iterating through it, then you might want to work with for loops. If you want to test, go through a file and get each line, you can say, while there's another line, go all the way through this file and read stuff in and execute it. Do something to the file. Do while loop. You want to set up connections or that kind of thing before you start iterating. So you want to try to set up a connection with something else. So there are 4 different key ways of doing the same thing, but you would use them in different scenarios, either for ease of use, sometimes for flexibility, sometimes because it makes more sense to use one over the other, and you have those 4 tools now at your disposal. So from a programming standpoint now, you can declare variables, you can create your own classes and objects and your own types, you can create your own methods, you can make decisions in your code through selection, through if, else if, switch statements. You can iterate with for, while, do while, and for each. You know how to access the classes that are built for you. You know how to import them here. You know how to create namespaces. You have the tools. Now there's a lot to C# programming. We're going to go into a lot more. We're going to go into very specific things that you can do. We're going to build programs, more functional programs. But you have the tools up to this point. If you followed me through from the first video to now, you have the tools to start making programs that can do a lot of different things. You can get input from the user. You can perform calculations. You can do things multiple times based on user input. You can make decisions based on user input. So you have the tools if you get creative and you put them together and you really kind of lay your toolbox out and look at the fact that you can sequence, the fact that you can select, and the fact that you can iterate, and that you can create new data types that represent the world around you. You have, outside of all of these 1,000-page books on the C# language, those are really the core tools. Now, there are a lot of nuances and idiosyncrasies that you got to deal with, but for the most part, those are the key central tools that you're going to use in a lot of language: sequence, selection, and iteration. So now is when the fun really, really begins. And I look forward to making some really cool programs with you with what we've learned so far, and hopefully teach you about programming actual applications now, at least small applications, other than just showing you the syntax and how things work within the language. We're about to really open up into some fun stuff. So thank you for your patience, and let's get to the good stuff.